From discount coupon to corporate coup. How Amelia turned the tables on her toxic family. I stared at the cheap, wrinkled coupon sitting in my palm, my fingers trembling as I traced the faded ink. $200 off your next purchase at Budget Mart. This was my 30th birthday gift. Around me laughter erupted, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers of the exclusive rooftop restaurant my family had chosen for this celebration. A place where a single glass of wine cost more than what they thought my existence was worth. Oh, come on, Amelia, don't look so offended. My older brother Ethan chuckled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. We figured you could use a little help, you know. Since you're always scraping by. Scraping by. That's what they thought. My mother, Vivian Monroe, flashed me her signature tight-lipped smile. The same one she used when dismissing unimportant things. It's practical, sweetheart. You've always been frugal. Across the table, my father barely looked up from his phone. Walter Monroe, the self-made real estate tycoon, the master of building empires, only acknowledged those he deemed worthy, and in his eyes, I never had been. You should be grateful, he muttered, typing away. Ethan worked hard to arrange this dinner for you. Hard. I almost laughed. Ethan, the golden son, had never worked for anything in his life. His job as vice president of Van Buren Capital had been handed to him by birthright, not skill. And they thought I was struggling? They thought I was the failure? They had no idea. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the secret I'd carried for years. The one I had sacrificed everything to protect. A vibration in my pocket snapped me out of my haze. I pulled out my phone and glanced at the notification. Confirmed. Acquisition finalized. Van Buren Capital is now under Monroe Holdings. My grip tightened. I owned Van Buren Capital, the very company my family worshipped, the one that made Ethan's entire career possible. Now it belonged to me. A slow-burning satisfaction spread through my chest. They had spent years mocking me, dismissing me, treating me like an afterthought. Tonight, they thought they were humiliating me with a discount coupon. Tomorrow, they would wake up to a nightmare. I slid my phone away, smoothing out my expression before forcing a polite smile. Thanks, Ethan, I said, my voice calm. This is thoughtful. He grinned, completely oblivious. Anything for my little sister. Oh, speaking of which, my sister Olivia cut in, leaning across the table. Have you considered Ethan's offer yet? He's willing to pull some strings at Van Buren, maybe get you an assistant job. I almost choked on my water. An assistant job. At the company I just bought? I glanced at my father, expecting him to shut her down. Instead, he nodded in approval, as if the suggestion made perfect sense. You should take the opportunity, Amelia. It's time you learned how the real world works. The real world. I gritted my teeth, biting back the explosion building inside me. The real world was what I had been dominating for the past decade. While they saw me as a failure, I had been silently building an empire. One strategic investment at a time. But they still saw me as the weak one, the disappointment, the charity case. I glanced at the coupon in my hand, then at my oblivious family sipping their expensive drinks without a care in the world. They wouldn't be laughing for long. I set my glass down carefully, deliberately. Actually, I said, standing up, I won't need Ethan's help. My mother frowned. Sit down, Amelia. We haven't even had dessert. Some of us have work tomorrow. Important things to handle, I replied smoothly, adjusting my blazer. Ethan smirked, leaning back in his chair. What, another part-time gig at that little marketing firm? Or are you finally getting serious about finding a real job? I turned to him, tilting my head slightly. Oh, I'm getting very serious, Ethan. I pulled out a crisp $1,000 bill and dropped it on the table. 10 times the value of their pathetic coupon for the tip. Since you raised me to always pay my debts, I said, meeting my father's gaze. Then, without another word, I turned and walked out. Behind me, I heard Olivia scoff. God, she's so dramatic. Dramatic? They haven't seen dramatic yet. I stepped outside into the cold Manhattan night and pulled out my phone. The screen glowed with a single message from Jacob, my business partner. All set. Press release goes live at 6 a.m. I smiled. Tomorrow, when Ethan walked into his office, he would find out he no longer had one. I tapped my screen, calling Jacob. Is it done? I asked as he picked up. His voice was steady. Congratulations, Amelia. You're officially the majority shareholder of Van Buren Capital. My fingers traced the cheap plastic coupon, still clutched in my other hand. How poetic, I whispered. Perfect. Time to show my family exactly who they underestimated. I wasn't always like this. There was a time when I wanted nothing more than their approval. I spent years trying to prove myself, to show them that I was worth more than their pity. But no matter what I did, no matter how hard I worked, it was never enough. Because in my family, success wasn't earned. It was inherited. Ethan was given his cushy position at Van Buren Capital straight out of college. No experience, no qualifications, just a last name that opened every door. Meanwhile, I graduated top of my class with a degree in finance. I had the grades, I had the skills, I had everything they claimed mattered. But when I asked my father for a position at Van Buren, he just laughed. You're not cut out for this world, Amelia. That was all he said before dismissing me with a wave of his hand. Ethan, lounging in their pristine living room, grinned like it was all a joke. Don't take it personally, sis. Dad just doesn't want to see you struggle. Grateful? I begged for a chance. I told them I didn't need a high position. I would start at the bottom, work my way up. But my father refused. You'll embarrass yourself, he said. And worse, you'll embarrass me. That was the moment I realized the truth. They never wanted me to succeed because if I did, it would prove that their entire system was a lie. So I left. I took the first job I could get, a low-level analyst position at a tiny investment firm. No prestige, no connections, just me, my brain, and an unshakable resolve. I worked longer hours than anyone else, studied every market shift, every financial trend. I lived in a cramped studio apartment, drove a beat-up car, and wore second-hand suits. While my family sneered at me, to them I was the failure. What they didn't know was that every penny I saved was being invested. While Ethan and Olivia spent their trust funds on luxury vacations and designer clothes, I was buying shares, acquiring assets, and making moves they couldn't even comprehend. And now, a decade later, the company they built their entire identities around was mine. But they still had no idea. I stood outside Van Buren Capital's headquarters, staring up at the gleaming glass tower that had always been close to me, not anymore. This morning I wasn't just walking into an office. I was walking into my empire. Jacob was waiting for me in the executive parking lot, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by something tighter, more serious. They're already panicking, he said, handing me a sleek black folder. Ethan's been calling board members all morning, trying to figure out who the new owner is. I smirked. And they're keeping tight-lipped just like we planned. As far as he knows, the takeover was done by a private equity firm. Perfect. I walked through the rotating glass doors, my heels clicking against the marble floor. Every receptionist, every security guard, every employee turned to look at me, most with confusion, some with recognition. They only knew me as Ethan's lesser sister, the one who never quite measured up. They had no idea that by the end of the day, everything would change. I took the elevator straight to the executive floor, stepping into a conference room where the board members sat in intense silence. At the head of the table, Ethan looked like he hadn't slept. His suit was wrinkled, his usual arrogance replaced by something that looked dangerously close to fear. What the hell is going on? He demanded, slamming his hands onto the table. I took my time setting my folder down, savoring the growing tension in the room. You're about to find out, I said smoothly, sliding into the chair at the head of the table. Ethan stared at me, then he laughed, a short, disbelieving laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. This is cute, Amelia, really? But this isn't your playground. This is a billion-dollar corporation. Maybe if you had accepted my offer yesterday, you'd be getting coffee right now instead of embarrassing yourself. The board members shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was wrong. I smiled. Then I pulled out the official acquisition papers and placed them on the table. I'm not here for coffee, Ethan. I leaned forward. I'm here to run the company. The room fell deathly silent. Ethan's face drained of color as he stared at the documents. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. My father had always told me that business was about power, and right now I had all of it. Amelia, his voice was barely a whisper. What did you do? I leaned back, crossing my arms. I did what you never could. I earned it. Ethan was frozen in place, his fingers gripping the acquisition documents as if he could change the words by sheer will. This isn't real, he muttered, flipping through the pages with frantic desperation. There's no way. Believe it, Ethan, I said, my voice steady. I own Van Buren Capital now. The boardroom was silent save for the ticking of the clock on the far wall. The board members, men and women who had spent years catering to my father and brother, were too stunned to speak. Ethan's breathing was uneven, his skin pale. I watched as realization dawned on him slowly, painfully. He wasn't just losing his job. He was losing everything. Amelia, he whispered, voice cracking. We're family. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs. Funny, you didn't seem to care about that when you were laughing at me last night. Ethan's jaw clenched. He turned to the board, desperate to regain control. This is a mistake. My father, your father, I cut in, no longer has any power here. I reached into my folder and pulled out the final piece of the puzzle, a signed contract restructuring the leadership of Van Buren. I slid it across the table, tapping the bolded text at the top. Effective immediately, you are being placed under performance review. Ethan stared at the words, his breath catching in his throat. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. His fingers curled into fists. You're joking, he said. I smiled. Not at all. His gaze snapped to the board members, his voice rising in panic. You can't just let her do this. I've been running this company for 4 years. Poorly, I finished. I turned my laptop screen around, displaying the company's financial records. The East Coast division, your division, has been operating at a 40% loss for 3 consecutive quarters. The only reason you weren't fired months ago is because of Dad's influence. Ethan flushed red, his jaw tightening. Under my leadership, I continued, this company will no longer be a playground for entitled trust fund executives. Either you prove your worth or you're out. A chair scraped against the floor as Ethan shoved back from the table, shaking with rage. You think you can come in here and take everything from me? His voice was low, furious, dangerous. You think you're better than me? I met his glare with a calm, steady stare. No, Ethan. I stood, straightening my blazer. I don't think I'm better. I know I am. The muscles in his jaw twitched, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. For a second, I thought he might explode right then and there. But then his expression shifted. The fury in his eyes was suddenly replaced by something else. A slow, creeping smirk. And I didn't like it. Ethan took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and leaned against the table with mocked confidence. You're smart, Amelia, he admitted, shaking his head. I'll give you that. Smarter than I gave you credit for. He chuckled, rubbing a hand over his face. But here's the thing. His gaze met mine, sharp and calculating. You don't know everything. A chill ran down my spine. What are you talking about? Ethan exhaled dramatically, like he was enjoying this moment. Then slowly, he pulled out his own phone and slid it across the table. The screen was still on, an email inbox open to a single unread message. A message from our father's lawyer. Subject line, urgent. Ownership dispute at Van Buren Capital. My heart stopped. Ethan's smirk widened. You really thought Dad would let you take everything that easily? I grabbed the phone and scanned the email, my fingers tightening around the device. According to the message, Walter Monroe had filed a legal challenge against my acquisition. Looks like Daddy still has a few tricks up his sleeve, Ethan murmured. And he's calling in some very powerful favors. I kept my face neutral, but my mind was racing. This wasn't part of the plan. Everything I did was by the book. The acquisition was airtight, completely legal. But my father, Walter Monroe, wasn't just powerful. He was ruthless. And if he was pulling legal strings, then this wasn't just about the company anymore. It was war. I set the phone down carefully, refusing to let Ethan see even a flicker of uncertainty. If you think I'm scared, I said coolly, you're wrong. Ethan leaned forward, eyes gleaming. We'll see. I grabbed my folder, tucked it under my arm, and turned for the door. But just as I reached it, Ethan's voice stopped me cold. Oh, and Amelia. I hesitated. You might want to check your emails too. A slow sense of dread crawled up my spine. I pulled out my phone. One new message from Walter Monroe. Subject: You just made the biggest mistake of your life. I felt the blood drain from my face. For the first time since this started, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not regret, not fear, but anticipation. Because if my father wanted to start a war, I was more than ready to finish it. I sat in my office, the city skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but my focus was locked on the email. You just made the biggest mistake of your life. Walter Monroe didn't make idle threats. My father was a kingmaker, a man who had built his empire by crushing anyone who stood in his way. And now, for the first time, I was his enemy. I took a slow breath, pushing the tension from my shoulders. I had anticipated resistance, but I hadn't expected him to strike back this fast. I clicked on the email, scanning the message. Legal jargon, a formal challenge to my acquisition. A claim that I had used insider information. It was all lies. Every move I made was by the book. But that didn't matter. In business, power mattered more than truth. And my father had spent a lifetime accumulating power. I was ready for a fight. What I wasn't ready for was what happened next. 40 minutes later, the emergency board meeting began. The boardroom was packed, tension simmering in the air. Ethan sat at the far end of the table, smug as ever, arms crossed like he had already won. I stood at the head, my fingers resting lightly on the conference table. I had spent years fighting for this moment. Now it was time to prove I belonged here. My voice was steady as I spoke. My acquisition was legal. My leadership is already improving the company. This is nothing but a desperate attempt to hold on to power. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided my gaze. That's when my father's lawyer, Richard Vaughn, cleared his throat. Miss Monroe, there's an issue. His hesitation sent a spike of unease through my spine. I kept my expression unreadable. What issue? He slid a document across the table. I picked it up and my heart stopped. It was a contract with my name on it, a contract I had never signed. According to this, I had agreed 3 weeks ago to transfer my shares to a holding company owned by Walter Monroe. This wasn't just a legal challenge, it was a setup. Perfect ironclad fraud. I barely heard Ethan chuckle beside me. I looked up, my vision sharpening like a blade. This is fake. Richard folded his hands. Then you'll have no problem proving that in court. I clenched my jaw. They knew. They knew that courts took months, even years, to resolve disputes like this. By the time I cleared my name, the damage would be done. My ownership would be frozen. Ethan would be reinstated as CEO. My father had played his move flawlessly. I exhaled slowly. He thought he had won. He had no idea that I had been planning for this exact moment. I tapped the microphone embedded in the table. Ladies and gentlemen, I said, keeping my voice smooth. It seems my father believes he can rewrite history. Ethan smirked. Or maybe he just knows how to play the game better than you. I tilted my head. You know what's funny, Ethan? I reached into my folder and pulled out my own document. This one very real. I slid it across the table to Richard. His face lost all color. Ethan leaned forward, trying to see what had shaken him. What is that? Richard swallowed hard. His voice was barely above a whisper. A dissolution agreement. I smiled. That's right. I turned to the board. 3 days ago, I officially dissolved Monroe Holdings. Murmurs erupted. Ethan shot out of his chair. You what? I let the moment sink in. My father had assumed I would run Van Buren Capital under Monroe Holdings, the investment company I had secretly built for years. What he didn't know was that I had shut it down, transferred every single asset into a new company, one he had no control over. His fraudulent contract was worthless. Walter Monroe had just lost his greatest battle before he even realized it started. Ethan looked like he was going to explode. You think this is over? He spat. Dad's going to. I raised a hand.
No, Ethan.
I reached for my phone, tapped a contact, and held it up for the room to hear. The line rang twice before my father's voice came through. What the hell have you done? The board members froze. Ethan's smirk vanished. I leaned back in my chair victorious. Just what you taught me, Dad, I said softly. I won. Did Amelia just deliver the ultimate revenge? Or is Walter planning his next move? Comment if you want to see what happens next. Silence filled the boardroom, thick and unforgiving. Ethan sat frozen, his face pale with disbelief. The board members, once loyal to my father, now shifted uneasily in their seats, realizing they had backed the wrong horse. And through the speakerphone, Walter Monroe's voice, usually so unshakable, was cold and flat. Amelia, what the hell have you done? I leaned forward, savoring the moment. I did what you always told me to do, Dad. I took control. The weight of my words sank in. And for the first time in my life, my father, the man who had spent years dismissing me, belittling me, underestimating me, was silent. Ethan, however, wasn't. This is a bluff, he spat, scrambling for control, his hands gripping the table like it was the only thing keeping him afloat. There's no way you. I didn't let him finish. I turned to the board, sliding one final document across the table. Van Buren Capital is no longer under Monroe Holdings, I stated clearly. And as the sole majority shareholder, I'm making my first executive decision. I looked directly at Ethan. You're fired. The room exploded. Ethan shoved back his chair, knocking over a glass of water. You can't. I can. I cut in, my voice sharp. And I just did. I turned to the board members, who were too stunned to argue. If anyone has objections, you're welcome to voice them. But let's be honest. I gestured to the financial reports on the screen. He was sinking this company. You all knew it. You just didn't care because my father was protecting him. No one spoke, because they knew I was right. Ethan's breathing was ragged, his face turning a deep shade of red, his hands clenched into tight fists. And for a second I thought he might lose control completely. But before he could lash out, the conference room doors swung open. Security. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their expressions stone cold. Mr. Ethan Monroe? One of them announced. We need you to come with us. Ethan whirled around, his eyes wide with genuine fear. What? He stammered. My lips curled into a slow, satisfied smile. Oh, didn't I mention? Before this meeting, I sent a full financial audit of Van Buren to the Securities and Exchange Commission. Ethan's blood drained from his face. You? I shrugged, mock disappointment dripping from my voice. Turns out someone's been embezzling company funds to cover their personal expenses. And after I took over, well, I sighed. The numbers didn't add up. Ethan's entire body tensed. Dad will fix this, he whispered almost to himself. And then, as if on cue, the speakerphone crackled. Walter Monroe's voice, usually so unshakable, was cold and flat. I'm sorry, Ethan. Ethan froze, his head snapped toward the phone, his mouth opening slightly, stunned. Walter sighed. I told you to cover your tracks. You didn't. Now you have to deal with the consequences. Ethan looked like he had been punched in the stomach. Dad, please. But the line went dead. Security moved in, gripping Ethan by the arms. He tried to fight, but it was useless. Amelia. He hissed, his voice shaking with fury. You think you've won? This isn't over. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. Oh, Ethan, I whispered. It was over the moment you gave me that discount coupon. His face twisted in pure hatred. And then he was dragged away. The moment the door shut, a weight lifted off my chest. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just fighting to be seen. I was seen. The board members exchanged glances, waiting for me to speak. I exhaled slowly, smoothing my blazer. Now that we've cleaned house, I said, steady and controlled, let's talk about the future. They straightened in their seats, sensing the shift in power. I was no longer the ignored daughter, the underestimated sister, the outsider. I was in charge. And for the first time they knew it. That night, I returned home to my penthouse. Not the modest apartment my family thought I still lived in. Jacob was waiting, a bottle of champagne in hand. Well, he said, pouring me a glass, you did it. I took the glass, swirling the liquid before meeting his gaze. No, Jacob, I corrected. I won. Jacob grinned. clinking his glass against mine. To new beginnings. I took a slow sip, letting the weight of everything I had fought for settle in. Ethan was gone, my father was powerless, and I was finally undeniably in control. The girl they once laughed at was now the one holding their fate in her hands. And the best part? I wasn't finished yet. Because this wasn't just about revenge, this was about rewriting the rules. And I was just getting started. Did Amelia's revenge satisfy you? Or do you think there's more to the story? Comment if you want a bonus epilogue, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more MD Reddit FM.